Hello, and welcome to Are You Grants Ready? Grant Readiness for Nonprofit Organizations. My name is Raychl Speigner, and I'm excited to present this topic to you today. First, I would like to thank the Raise More Together Summit for the opportunity to share one of my favorite topics with the audience. Again, my name is Raychl Speigner, and I am the founder and CEO of Speigner Grant Solutions. We are a fundraising consulting company that provides grant services and resources to nonprofits to empower and elevate their fundraising. In today's presentation, we will cover 3 key areas that are critical to grant readiness. First, we will discuss organizational structure. We'll discuss your organization's capacity, which sets the foundation for seeking out and receiving grants. Then we'll talk about fundraising strategy, where we'll discuss how a fundraising strategy is beneficial to grant readiness. And then we will cover grants and grant management. We'll discuss how having a grant structure and processes support your organization's grant readiness. Now let's talk about grant readiness and understand what it is and why it is important. So grant readiness is the assessment of your organization's capacity to engage in the full cycle of the grant process. It is important to know there is more to the grants process than just researching, writing, and submission of grant applications. Many times, nonprofit staff think it's just a matter of 1, becoming a nonprofit, and 2, submitting a grant to receive funding. However, there is more your organization must do to be seen as competitive and to have a firm foundation to receive grants. Grant readiness is also important because many funding institutions want to see organizations with 3 to 5 years of experience from a nonprofit before considering awarding them a grant. Now, this is not to say all foundations operate this way. However, it is something to keep in mind as your organization decides to engage in the full grant process. So here we have a few phrases that I hear from nonprofit organizations regarding grants. Statements like these let me know the organization is not yet ready to engage in the full grant process. These are common phrases that I hear almost on a daily basis from clients. So you may even, as we go through these, you may have even found yourself saying some of these at one point in time. First, we just received our 501c3 letter and we are now ready to apply for grants. Then we'll develop the program budget when it's time to submit a proposal. All we need to do is write the grant, then money will come in. We don't have an organizational budget. Again, when I work with clients and they say one of these phrases to me, it immediately lets me know that they are not yet ready to approach the grant process. And therefore, we need to work on building a firm foundation to even get to the point where they can start submitting grant applications to funders. The first key area that we will discuss is your organizational structure. A good organizational structure is key to achieving the next 2 areas in our presentation of fundraising strategy and the grants process. As part of your structure, there are a number of items your organization should have in place before seeking funding. As we walk through the list, please keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list and items may vary depending upon your organization. So first, let's cover the documents your nonprofit should have before applying for grants. You should have an IRS determination letter, which is the official letter from the IRS stating your tax-exempt status as a nonprofit organization. Then your organizational history, mission, and vision statements. Then your financials. This covers your 990s, audited financial statements, organization budget, program budget, etc. This shows the health of the organization, and funders typically request these documents when applying for grant awards. So next, let's get into tools. And these are systems or software that your organization should have in place for operation. So this could include a financial management system to track income and expenses for the organization, a payroll system to track staff hours or any volunteer hours if volunteer hours need to be tracked. And then if your organization is responsible for distributing items or receiving items, a tracking system will help so that you can manage that information within your organization. I understand that software and other systems can be a bit pricey for nonprofit organizations. So even if you operate in smaller systems, maybe you're operating in spreadsheets, I just highly recommend that you have a system in place for how often those documents are updated, who's responsible for updating them, and how information will be tracked. Then here we have a roadmap, and this guides where your organization is going. So with your strategic plan, this is knowing where your organization will be today, tomorrow, and plans for at least the next 3 to 5 years down the road. Your case statement, which we'll touch on in the next section, which describes to prospective funders why they should give to your organization. And then your operations plan. So how your organization will operate on a day-to-day basis. Also knowing how your operation plan fits into the software and systems for operation that your nonprofit has set in place. Next, we have programs. So it's important to document your organization's programs and their implementation plans so that when funds come in the door, you're not trying to figure out at that time how to implement your program. It's also important to have a statement of need and knowing the need that your organization meets. And you want to make sure that that data is fully researched. So it's one thing to say, I'm providing tutoring to children because they really need it in my neighborhood. And it's another thing to say, the Department of Education did research and they found X, Y, and Z, and this is why tutoring is important. So it's important to have a statement of need that is backed by data. Then your evaluation methods. So how will you evaluate the program to ensure that you are meeting the goals and the need that you have identified to the funder? And then we have goals, data, and metrics. So knowing what your program goals are, the data you want to capture from the implementation of the program, developing a logic model so you know how the program is designed and your short-term, long-term, and intermediate outcomes and outputs. And then knowing what success looks like for your organization so that you can refine your program over time. And then the last category is capacity. In this category, someone has to do the work for your organization and lead the organization. So you want to consider your staff's capacity. This means knowing how many people will lead the organization. Is there an executive director and then everyone else is staff? Or is there a CEO and then a leadership team and then directors and other layers within the organization? When it comes to department staff, how many people are leading programs? How many are supporting? And one thing about program staff, it's important to be realistic about your staff's capacity and how many programs they can actually take on at one time. And then lastly, we have the board of directors and their governance structure. So thinking about how many people are on the board, what their structure is, how do they or will they interact with staff, their diverse, is it a diverse board, and how often they will meet. Again, having all of these items in place that are listed here under organizational structure will help build a firm foundation for your nonprofit, which will ultimately help your organization become ready to seek out funding in the future. Now let's get into the second key area of fundraising strategy. The fundraising strategy not only guides your efforts around the grant process and which grants you should apply for, but it will also support your other fundraising efforts when it comes to raising money from individual donors, major donors, your board, corporate sponsorships, etc. So here are 3 documents that I have listed that I think will, number 1, strengthen your fundraising strategy, and then 2, move your organization closer to becoming grant ready. So first, we have the case for support. This document makes the case for why prospective funders should give to your organization and how funding will be used. This document is usually 3 to 10 pages long, depending on your organization, and describes your programs, needs, and why the funding is needed. Depending on how the case for support is written, it can also be used as a resource to pull language from when you are developing your grant proposal. The fundraising plan is a document that outlines your organization's plan to achieve its funding goals. You don't know where you're going with fundraising if you don't have a plan in place. In your fundraising plan, you want to develop methods for how you will achieve the fundraising goals outlined in your organizational budget. And this is why having an organization budget and program budget are important, because it will help your organization determine how many grants, the size of grants you need to apply for to support your organization. However, I highly recommend diversifying your funding and not solely relying on grants to support your organization. And the third document is the sustainability plan. This document explains how your organization and programs will be sustained with or without grants. Many times when submitting grant proposals, funders ask what the sustainability plan is if funding is not received or when the grant period ends and funding runs out. Your organization should be able to fully describe what will happen if funds are not received, how your organization will continue to implement its programs. If you receive funding, how the program will continue once the grant period ends. And you should be able to describe what other sources your organization is reaching out to support the programs. So again, you have your case for support, fundraising plan, and sustainability plan. And again, it's very important to have organization budgets and program budgets so that you know how to set up your fundraising strategy and these 3 documents so you can fundraise throughout the year and for your programs. So we have our organizational structure in place and our fundraising strategy and 3 documents are developed. So now let's get into the actual grant process, our third key area. When it comes to the grant process, I have outlined some areas here that are important to the grant seeking process. Now, everyone's process may look different. However, you should know who is responsible for each of these areas and what the process is for your organization. When it comes to research, it's important to know who and how often research is conducted and what happens with that information. Prospect research can take a long time to complete, so I recommend maybe setting aside some time once a month to conduct prospect research and seeing what opportunities are out there for your organization to apply for. Then we have relationship building. Who is the relationship builder for the organization? This may be one person or multiple people depending on the size of your team. You want to know what your organization's preferred method of relationship building is, and if there are any tracking systems in place for when someone speaks to a potential funder, how other members of the team can see that information so that you are not approaching the same people all the time and with 2 different members of your team. Then we have the grants calendar. I utilize a grants calendar on a daily basis to know when my projects are due, and my client manages the grants calendar. For your organization, you want to know who on your team will manage the grants calendar to ensure proposals are submitted on time and when grants are added to the calendar. So it could be that the same person that conducts the prospect research then adds the grants to the grants calendar, or the relationship builder could share that information with the person who is monitoring the grants calendar. So really figure out what that process is for getting grants from being in the research stage to on your calendar so that you can apply for them and you don't miss any deadlines. Then we have proposal development and submission. So knowing which staff member will be responsible for developing the proposal. This also includes various levels of review before the proposal is submitted. So knowing who within the organization should review the grant proposal before it is submitted to the funder. as well as who will be responsible for submitting the application to the funder. Maybe it's the person developing the proposal, or maybe it's someone else. So knowing the responsible parties for proposal and submission are very important. Then we have tracking. So who is responsible for tracking when proposals are submitted to funders and reaching out if follow-up is needed? So this could be for tracking, maybe the person who manages the grants calendar could also track when grants are submitted. Maybe the relationship builder will be responsible for following up with the funder. If the funder said you'll hear back in 3 months and now it's month six and you have not heard anything back. So again, really knowing what your organization's grant process is will help your organization move toward grant readiness and then have an easier time applying for grants in the future. Then we get into grants management, and this is where you do not want to drop the ball. If your organization has not yet applied for grants, or maybe you received funding and you still want to have a grants management system in place, it is important to have all these policies and procedures outlined up front so that you're not scrambling around when grants are awarded trying to figure out what we should do. So when it comes to the agreement and funding, you should have policies in place for agreement review and signing. And you should know how funding is received and tracked during the grant period. So agreement review and signing, this could mean working with your finance team, your executive director, CEO to find out who has signing authority for the organization. And if multiple people have signing authority, does person A have signing authority up to a certain amount, and then person B then takes over once grants are above that amount? And then knowing how funding is received and tracked, that goes back to your organizational structure and having software and systems in place so that you can track when dollars come into your organization's door and how they are allocated to the programs so that you can report back to the funder that your organization spent the money as promised. Then when it comes to implementation, you want to have a written process for how programs are implemented within the organization and the handoff process from the grants team to a program team. Again, going back to your organizational structure, you should have developed a document that outlines how your programs are implemented. So again, when funding comes in the door, it's almost like you can hit the ground running when funding is received. And then a handoff process from the grants team to program team is important because when a funder notifies your organization that a grant is awarded, they typically notify either the CEO, executive director, or someone on the development team. The program team sometimes the last to know. So what I like to do is to hold a handoff meeting so that I can then share everything with the program team that we promised to the funder. Now, I highly recommend engaging your program team in the proposal process before you submit the grant so that the handoff meeting is not the first time they are hearing about this funding, and so they are not caught off guard when this funding comes into your organization and now they have to implement a program that they were not aware of. And then monitoring, making sure the organization is adhering to grant terms for the grant period, the project is operated according to the proposal, funding is spent as proposed, and reports are submitted on time. So you want to make sure that someone is responsible for monitoring the overall success of the program, because at the end of the grant period, or if the funder decides they want to interim report, your organization will have to report to the funder about how the program is moving along, the amount of funding that has been spent to date, and you don't want to drop the ball on this piece because it can greatly impact a second or third payment for your organization or receiving renewal funding in the future. So you want to make sure that you have policies and procedures for your agreement and funding, your implementation, and monitoring of the overall grants management process. So to wrap up, becoming grant ready, it is important to 1, have a firm organizational structure, 2, develop a fundraising strategy to guide your grants efforts, and 3, a grants process and procedures in place to manage the overall grant process moving forward. So here are a list of questions to consider before your organization decides to apply for grants. Do we have the capacity for grants? What is our fundraising goal? What are our methods for evaluation and metrics? Have we thoroughly researched the need for this project with data points? Can our program team successfully implement the project? Can we demonstrate at least 3 years of successfully implementing the project? How and who will manage the awarded grant? How will we sustain the project with or without funding? I would also like to share some commonly requested documents which tie into having a firm organizational structure. Once your structure is in place, you should easily be able to pull together these documents to provide to funders as you apply for grant opportunities. So we have IRS determination letter, audited financial statements, 990, income and expense statements, evaluation plans and metrics, list of board members with affiliations, board meeting minutes, annual report, staff resumes, program descriptions, organization budget, and program budget. As a thank you to you all for attending the grant readiness presentation, if you visit my website, speignersolutions.com/freebie, you will be able to download your own grant readiness checklist to check where your organization is against grant readiness. So again, visit speignersolutions.com/freebie to download your grant readiness checklist. If you have any questions or need any clarifications, I would love to help you. So below is my email address as well as my website. You can also feel free to connect with me on any of the social media platforms. Again, thank you to Raise More Together Summit for allowing me to share this presentation with you all, and have a good day.